I was advised to give a 1 or 2 minute warning before we start, so this is your 2-minute warning. If you do not have a book, if you will raise your hand, one will be brought to you. This is going to be the basis of our study. I say basis kind of in a loose use of the word, simply because we will use this as the guide for topics. The articles will closely relate. Bob, right here in the middle. They'll closely relate to the articles that we find in here, but we will depart as it's important to the discussion that we're trying to undertake. I understand that Bob started the class last time. Originally, I was supposed to be out of town through a good part of June. Jennifer and I made some changes to those plans, and I appreciate Bob asking me to do this, giving me the opportunity, and I will thank you in advance for your patience as we work through this study. I would ask that you keep my wife Jennifer in your prayers today. She is returning from a trip to Illinois. Her parents had a home in Illinois and were snowbirds to Florida. Her father passed away earlier this year, which has been extremely hard for the whole family, but especially for Jennifer. She was very close to her dad, and she went up to Illinois to help her mom clean out the house to get it ready to sail. So this has been a challenging week for her. She is now driving back by herself. She does not like driving to the grocery store, much less for 10 or 11 consecutive hours. She will leave about the time that we get to hear Michael this morning, so please keep her in your prayers as she is traveling today. So again, we are going to be using this issue of the spiritual sword. The theme of this issue is, have you found true happiness? And we're going to talk about happiness. It's been a little bit of a deep end dive to think about trying to pick up such a heavy topic, but it's a very important topic. So I will thank you, like I said, in advance for your patience with me. I once had a friend say that the study I did in Philemon was one of the best years that he had ever spent in class. It was more a joke about the time it took me to cover the material. The reason I take my time covering the material, especially with things like happiness and really anything out of the Bible, is the importance of what we're studying. So I will endeavor to have the class fully concluded in our conversation by August. But from time to time, we may take more than one Sunday on a particular topic. I will gauge over time and try to refine that so that we do get everything covered in a timely manner. So I want to jump ahead. This is a spoiler alert. We're going to go all the way to the end of this discussion. This is a discussion about finding true happiness. And what I want to say is that the conclusion is happiness is found in a life of faith and devotion to God and Christ. Now, we're going to look at various aspects of that, but it is important to understand that is the conclusion of what we're talking about. Now, understand last time Bob covered quite a bit of Ecclesiastes and how it deals with happiness, but we need to understand that when we get to the end of this, hopefully our conversation will help us get to the point of understanding true happiness and realizing that our faith, our understanding of the promises that are made to us by our God and the sacrifice of His Son are our drive for true happiness. For the majority of us, that's probably not a surprise, but we're going to examine this in detail so maybe we understand a little bit better why. Like I said, as we were talking about the text, I encourage you to read the articles. My goal is that this morning we start with page 4, Not by Riches. The text probably won't be something necessarily to follow along with in each morning's class, each Sunday morning class, but it is a place where you can get a preview of what we're going to discuss in the next class. So we're starting on the article on page 4. I want to tell you also that sometimes I will disagree with what we find in the text. Generally speaking, it's not a doctrinal disagreement, it's a matter of opinion. And any time in this class, when I'm talking about a matter of opinion, I'm going to try to make it very clear that what I'm about to say is an opinion. I think it is very important, and I have heard it here from this pulpit especially, when we are talking about matters of opinion, we make that clear. Because the opinion may be appropriate for my life, it may not be appropriate for yours. When it is a doctrinal matter, when the Word of God says something, we better work to the point that we get in agreement. But if it's my opinion, I'll share it, you can take it for what it's worth, and I'm always open to discuss that as well. As far as discussion goes, even in a class this large and this spread out, by the way, feel free to move forward if you would like to. There are open spaces down close. But in a class this large, I still like to try to keep it a conversation. I'm not interested in being a lecturer. My daughter, unfortunately, will tell you that I do like to talk. But if you have a question, if there's an aspect of this study that we need to spend more time on, I want us to have that conversation. Because we grow together in Bible study from studying together, not being spoken to without the chance to have some interaction. So I would encourage you to make your relevant comments. The one thing I ask is raise your hand. I get kind of into a stage presence and don't necessarily hear things. So if you raise your hand, I know that there's a comment that we need to consider. That just helps me keep things in a little bit better focus. So we're going to get into the realm of opinion for a couple of minutes, but I think it is important as we talk about happiness to have a little bit of a conversation about issues of mental health. I'm going to share some opinions based on personal observation, but still some opinions that I want you to consider in this study. I want to make sure that we make a distinction between choosing godly happiness, and you're going to hear me throughout the class talk about the difference between happiness and biblical happiness. There is quite a distinction, so we're going to get into that in some detail. But I want us to make sure we understand the difference between choosing godly happiness versus the physiological issues that are out of someone's control. Now let that sink in. This is an important distinction to understand. Just as we cannot truly know a person's heart, we cannot truly know their struggles, especially when those struggles involve mental illness. I am concerned within the church that two things need to be discussed about happiness. One, I fear that our society has created a sense of pride around the perception of mental illness, or maybe weakness is a better way to put it. I think as a society we've elevated the natural challenges of an earthly life to the status of a handicap, and I think that's very dangerous. Okay. But with that said, well, let me complete that thought. When our society does that, we have entire sections of the culture that feel like they need an infirmity to fit in. They need to express that something is wrong so that they can also have a reason to avoid personal responsibility. And that's probably the most dangerous aspect of that. Because as Christians, given free will, given the entirety, completeness of God's Word, our free will has got to guide us toward right decisions in His Word. So when we try to excuse ourselves from having personal responsibility, we take a very dangerous approach. Our culture would have us do that. The intentional weakening compounds my second fear. And my second fear is probably the overall most dangerous aspect. The second point relates to how we view and behave toward true mental illness. I'm concerned that we tend to approach depression and similar medical conditions as if they were something that a person could just snap out of. And if you or anyone you have known has ever suffered from one of these illnesses, I suspect you and that person would say, if I could snap out of it, that is precisely what I would do. I would love not to have this challenge in my life. And if it were a decision, I would make the decision to not deal with depression, to not deal with anxiety, to not have those challenges. Don't make that mistake. We're going to talk about happiness. Don't ever look at somebody and assume they're not happy because they've made that choice. We don't know. So we have to put that happiness decision in our life, show an example accordingly, and help where we can and have the knowledge to contribute in a positive way. If you know someone that suffers from depression or a similar medical issue, I want you to know enough about their life to encourage them to get professional medical help. I fear that in the church we have taken the approach of, well, they just have to decide to be better. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, yes, there are people, like I said in the first point, that culture has convinced, hey, you need some infirmity to fit in with everyone else. But if someone is struggling with clinical depression, if someone is struggling with a heart condition, here's one. If your child broke their arm, you'd look for the best orthopedist you could find, probably on the spur of the moment, but the best you could find in order to set that arm right, in order to make sure that bone was mended well enough that it can continue to grow. If your doctor said, hey, you know what, you got to do something about that blood pressure, or about that blood sugar, or those things, if we're honest, we would do something about that. If someone has challenges with mental health, encourage them to seek professional medical help. If you have any struggle to that effect, I would encourage you to do the same thing. So, I will get off of my soapbox now, and we will start the discussion about happiness. Sometimes heavy topics at the beginning kind of bring the class mood down. I don't want to do that because we are talking about being happy, and I want us to grow from that. So the overall topic, the overall conversation about happiness highlights another important point. One of the most important aspects of the Christian life is the opportunity to be involved in the lives of others. In Acts 4 and verse 32, it reads, "Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common." As we think about happiness, what I want us to think about is when the last time I helped someone made me feel better about everything in general. And understanding that is an aspect of influencing others' happiness as well. Does it not make you feel good to know that someone cares enough to ask, to offer, and then to physically help in some way? As we talk about happiness, we need to understand that as Christians, part of our role, part of our responsibility, and at a higher level, part of our wonderful opportunity is to know each other well enough that we know when something's wrong, that we know when something is good, that we know when there is something amiss and have the ability to affect that. Because if I don't know you, I'm not going to know whether that smile is genuine or forced. If I don't know you and I say, "How are you this morning?" I'm not going to be able to distinguish between, "Oh, I'm fine," and "I'm fine." And we need to do that because part of that happiness can be encouraged by fellow Christians. If we're going to help someone, if we're going to help one another through this earthly life, if we expect to fully understand what true happiness is, then we're going to have to strive to be even more like those first century Christians. We need to know each other. We need to know each other well enough to recognize when there are issues, and we need to know each other well enough to feel safe sharing things that are threatening and uncomfortable. So, it's a big group. We're a big congregation, especially in the upstate. Strive for that. And you can strive for that by picking one person and saying to yourself, I'm going to get to know them better and be a better friend. Okay, now, let's talk about happiness. When we talk about, quote, happiness, the word, we need to factor in the word contentment. And just a little forewarning, we're coming up to the interactive part, so turn your brains on and get ready, because I'm going to throw a question your way. If we're going to factor in contentment, does anybody want to venture a guess as to the distinction between happiness and contentment? Any thoughts? Okay, it has not been long enough for me to put you to sleep yet. So now's the opportunity to say, hey, I think, because there's no right and wrong answer, this is a study together so that we increase our knowledge overall. Yes, dear? Okay, the statement, you cannot be happy unless you are content. Any disagreement? Okay, let me try again. What's contentment? Chloe?
When I think of contentment, it's almost like you're not super happy, but you're not super sad, either you're just here.
Can we use the word satisfied?
Yeah.
Almost satisfied?
Yeah.
Okay. So contentment is, in my situation, I'm okay. All right, so what's happiness? Being a little bit more than okay. You know what? I think that is a fantastic way to describe that. So one of the things that we need to do early on is make sure that we come to a common distinction between those two words. And if we are truly focused on Christ, if we are focused on serving God better, where do we look for our definitions? In His Word. So, if we look for content in the Bible, the first place I tend to go is Philippians 4, beginning in verse 11. Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. And I will call out a lot of scriptures. My daughter will remind me to slow down, make sure people have a time to find it. And here's another aspect for after-class feedback. Let me know if this class would be better for you with a PowerPoint. I didn't prepare it this morning. In business settings, I use it a lot. Outside, and especially in the church, I have not used it a whole lot. If this class would be easier to follow, if it'd be easier to find the scriptures, or if you want me to put the scriptures on the screen, I will try to do that. Feel free to let me know after class. Philippians 4, beginning in verse 11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Content in the biblical terminology means to be possessed of an unfailing strength, to be strong, to suffice, to be enough. Do you get that? Let me read it again. To be possessed of an unfailing strength. Wow, I mean, that one's got me right there. No contentment for me. I don't have an unfailing strength. Okay, listen on. To be strong, to suffice, to be enough. It also is described, and I use things like Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, Vine's Bible Dictionary, and I will show you a resource if we get that far in class this morning. But we also find content described as a perfect condition of life in which no aid or support is needed. Okay, so when we talk about definitions, we are talking about the ultimate, complete, extreme definition of that word. To be able to say that I am content does not necessarily mean that I contain and embody 100% of that definition. Because as Christians, we always need the aid of the Word. We always need the aid of prayer. We always need the aid of the assembly and gathering together to be encouraged. So it's not saying that you as an individual, in order to be content, have to be fully self-contained, nothing needed from the outside. I'm it. That's not what it's talking about. But it's talking about a level of confidence that says, if it rains like mad on me on the way to the car, I'm okay. If I lose my job this week, I'm okay. Jay?
For me, I hope I can say this correctly. Being content, the things that are troublesome, as a Christian, there's always enough good things to offset the bad. So it's a balance. No matter how bad it is, we as Christians have Christ.
Yes.
It's not always physical. It's not always, it becomes a state of mind just as it does from the physical aspect. I mean, Paul had his challenges. He asked that his problem be taken away, and God basically said no.
Right.
I'm sufficient.
Yes.
And that plays a huge role in being content. That there's enough good to always offset the bad.
Did you hear Jay's point? As a Christian, there is always enough good to offset the bad, being a critical role in saying that we are content. Now, in part, he's jumping ahead, but the conversation is very important to have at this particular point. Because when we talk about happiness, there are really two happinesses. And I'll explain that in a minute. That point is crucial to understanding both. There is a concept that our culture has completely obliterated. The concept is called delayed gratification. You know what delayed gratification means? It means that you don't have to have the good instantly for life to be good. And listen carefully, is every aspect of Christian life always good and easy? I appreciate the laugh at that question. Because as Christians, we've got to know. Sometimes we will do exactly what we should. And we feel good because we know that that action is pleasing to God. And then something in the world happens to us. Something bad, something breaks, something gives way, someone passes away. Here's the distinction. The delayed gratification aspect of that means when I do what is right, it's not that moment that matters. Now, yes, that moment will build us up. It's not that moment that matters, but it is the journey toward heaven that matters. Heaven is that delayed gratification for a Christian. So the key there is to understand, yes, contentment has an aspect of there's more good than bad in life, especially for a Christian, and the realization that for a Christian, this life is just the prep work. This isn't the end all. This is just getting ready for what God has in store for us. Now, there's a lot of aspects. It is a very complex prep work, but there's a lot that we have to consider. So, yes, contentment. Think of it as, being well-founded in our faith to the point of taking the good and the bad without the highs and the lows of behavior and emotion. Emotion can be a hurtful thing sometimes. So what we have to do is be prepared and know, okay, this morning is going to be great. We get to come together with like-minded brothers and sisters and worship God the way He had said to. But then we have to leave here. And it's the leaving here that we got to be okay with. That's, to me, part of the contentment aspect. Okay, let's talk about happy. The word that's translated as happy only appears 3 times in the New Testament. You ever thought about that? Now, when I talk about appearing in text, when I quote scriptures, unless I tell you otherwise, I'm quoting from New King James Version. So if you use King James, sometimes there'll be a little bit of a difference. If you use some other translation, we can talk about that as well. I'm going to talk about another tool for study in just a minute. I keep alluding to that. I hope I don't run myself out of time this morning. So from the New King James, the word translated as happy only appears 3 times. And it really isn't the word that we commonly think of. In Romans 14 and verse 22, it says, "Do you have faith? Have it to yourself before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves." Romans 14, verse 22. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. So it's saying, in the things that we support, in the things that we partake in, we're happy if those things aren't wrong. That super simplification, putting it in Martin terms so Martin can understand what that's saying. That doesn't really sound quite like the happy that I'm used to talking about. It doesn't sound like the happy that is just a bit more than contented. So what is it? So while happy, our word, only shows up 3 times, we find the same Greek word 47 more times. Now, in talking about class and study, sometimes I'll bring in some tools that I use that you may have some interest in. A lot of times there'll be books. I also have a lot of the same things on my phone or my tablet or whatever. So if I ever point out a resource that you're interested in and don't have immediate access to, let me know and we can talk about it. This is an interlinear Greek-English New Testament. Okay, I do not speak Greek. I don't really read Greek, but I've got enough tools to go and find passages as they appeared in the original Greek. Okay, I don't speak Greek, I can't translate it, but I've got a tool right here that gives me, on one column, the King James, in the middle, the Greek word for word, and then on the far left, the literal translation. So, I am not saying that we have to know Greek to understand the Word of God. It is given to us in its completeness in a language that we can understand. But if we are serious about our study, and we have access to tools that will further our knowledge, why not take advantage of those? So, if we look at the exact word used in that Romans passage that is translated differently elsewhere, we find it 47 more times. James 1, beginning in verse 12. James 1:12 begins, "Blessed. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." The Greek word is makaros. No, I'm not saying it right. Makarios. And expresses more than happiness. It does express happiness. I'm not saying that if you're reading the New King James or the King James and not looking any further than that, it's telling you what you need to know. It's telling us what we need to know. But if we want to dive deeper, it's an understanding that that word implies being blessed, being happy, and being fortunate all at once. See the distinction? So we talk about contentment. We talk about happiness in the world's terms. My fear is that the world's diluted it down. The world's term meaning happiness is simply a temporary emotional state created by external influences. This morning, when the kids come in, watch. If somebody provides a piece of candy for a child, they have created the world's happiness in that child. Versus us developing an understanding that happiness is more than that emotion. It is a realization. And you will also hear me make another distinction. As Christians, sometimes I think we sell ourselves short when we say, "I believe." God has given us enough that in a lot of aspects we need to say, "I know." See the difference? The difference between believing and knowing is pretty strong. So the difference between being worldly happy and being biblical happy is of absolute importance. Because it is a matter of understanding that we have promises that nothing on this earth can ever match or challenge. We have opportunities that nothing else on this earth can ever match or challenge. Happiness, biblical happiness, is a realization of that and the corresponding behavior toward it. That makes sense. I will say that quite a bit. Others who have listened to my classes before know that sometimes, it sounds really great in my head, and when my mouth translates it, nobody has any clue what I'm talking about. I want to make sure we don't get into that situation. If I'm not clear, please raise your hand. The other aspect is, if I am wrong, please raise your hand. I hope I'm a big enough man that we can have that conversation here. If you're more comfortable and feel that I've been wrong, let's sit down person to person and go over that. But we've got three words that we need to understand: contentment, the world's happiness, and biblical happiness. Biblical happiness wraps its arms around all of that, but prevents that emotion from being a high that we deal with and from being a low that continually pulls us down. Does that make sense? Okay, so we talked about the fact that the modern idea is simply a state of mind dependent on a person's circumstances. And that aspect of circumstances is going to be very important in finding true happiness. Because, especially if you are over 30 years old, I want you to raise your hand if every day has always been exactly the way you wanted it. Again, I appreciate the laughter because that is a laughable statement. It's just not the situation. So the world tells us that we're only happy based on those external circumstances. So the world is telling us we can't be truly happy. You get that? Because if you're on social media, you'll see a lot of people complaining about being unhappy. And then you'll see on the flip side, people essentially saying, oh, I'm always happy. Things are always beautiful. My weight is always exactly where I want it. And my trips are always perfect. I never have any problems getting airport security. Okay? So the world talks about external circumstances. And if we analyze that carefully, we then understand that we can never be truly happy in the world's eyes. So as we talk about happiness, we've got to focus on the fact that we're not often going to be happy in the world's eyes. And that's an important distinction because we're going to be talking about what the world tells us we need in order to be happy. Okay? So, the biblical idea, the biblical happiness is a compound concept. It's got multiple aspects that are derived, one, from the assurances of God's blessings, sometimes immediate. Ever sat down at the kitchen table or your study or wherever you sit down and open your bills and think, how am I going to pay this bill? And then, within the week, you have the way to pay the bill. A lot of people will look at that and, forgive me, this is not meant in a blasphemous way. Those who are in denominations, especially those that express faith more as an emotion than a knowledge and belief, will say things like, oh, that's a God thing. Again, that is not meant blasphemously. I think that's a very dangerous statement. Because the promises that we are given are sometimes present, but are ultimately future promises. Paul did not have an easy life. But when you get down to it, we don't have easy lives as Christians. We talked about that earlier. We had a little laugh when I said, is every day easy? We know that it's not. So God's promises are for the long term. The second concept with biblical happiness is our gratitude for those blessings. I know that I have the opportunity to go to heaven. I know it. I don't just believe it. I know it. Is my life filled with gratitude because of that? Because that's going to play a role in my happiness. I know it. I know that I fall short. Am I going to condemn myself? Am I going to pile emotion on top of myself so that I can never show the gratitude that needs to be part of that biblical happiness? And then the third aspect is the unwavering, key word, decision. Decision that we make to acknowledge those blessings as the most valuable possession we can ever hold. And possession, obviously, in a spiritual sense, it's not like somebody can hand me my salvation and I can just put it in my pocket with my little notebook and my mints. It's an intangible, but we recognize that we can possess that because He's told us how. That's what biblical happiness is talking about. And note that we have a major decision to continually make in order to be happy. It is easy to be here, maybe not when I'm running my mouth. It is easy to be here and be happy, to be in the realization of what God has given us. But when we get past the stoplight down there, or when we get past whatever is at the end of the road this way, is it still easy? That decision takes work, it takes reinforcement, and it is a challenge. So, we've talked about the distinction. This is a lot to process, I realize that. And I may have compounded the difficulty in processing it. I will endeavor through each morning, each Sunday that we are together, to bring further light to that aspect of the conversation. I am now, with just a few minutes left, about ready to talk about the riches aspect, which is the article at hand for this morning. It's a lot to process. We will revisit it frequently. Not in this level of detail, but in the context of the article. So, in the context of the article, entitled Not by Riches, is it possible to be happy and wealthy? I see some nods. I hear a couple of yeses. Any disagreement? Good. Now, let's make that question more complex. Is it possible to be wealthy and happy in the sense that the Bible describes? The answer, again, should be yes, but with a comma at the end of it. Yes, but wealth brings with it specific challenges for the Christian. Now, I'm not going to bash wealth and riches yet. Wealth and riches bring a lot of opportunity. From everything I have heard in this congregation, the wealth of this congregation has done fantastic things worldwide for the church. I know individuals who are, in the world standards even, just massively wealthy. You wouldn't know it unless you could see all of the things that they did for others and especially for the church. So, yes, wealth brings opportunity, and you can be wealthy and biblically happy, but it does bring specific challenges that we have to watch for. Now, on the other end, is it possible to live in poverty and be happy? In the world sense? Now, there's a head nodding, I completely agree with it, but in the world sense, the answer would be no. And that's a lot of the behaviors we're seeing on the television. A lot of what we're seeing put forth in front of us as news suggests if you don't have money, if you don't have that bigger TV, if you don't have that nicer car, how could you possibly be happy? But when I said, can you live in poverty and be happy? The head nodded, and the answer is absolutely yes, because we focus on biblical happiness. We don't worry what the world is telling us about money, about possessions. And we're going to have to talk about that more in order to make sure that we understand it. You see, the challenges that we're talking about and the distinction in the conversation about poverty is partly based on the fact that wealth is an external condition. When we talk about money, when we talk about things that we can physically possess, that's an external condition. Biblical happiness is internal. It is inside. It is not based on the things that I can pick up, put in my pocket, and go home and play with. We'll dig into that statement a little more deeply as we go through some of the other common pursuits, but keep it in mind. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes. When is second bell? What time specifically? 10:15? Okay, so I got 3 minutes. I'm about a tenth of the way through, so. Okay, so, and we may leave with this thought to ponder for next time. We will get through this at least next time. What are the risks of trying to base our happiness on wealth or possessions? A lot of times we think about wealth and we think about people that could pull out a wallet full of money or could pull out a gold credit card or whatever. But don't be fooled into thinking, and we'll talk about how riches are deceitful. Don't be fooled into thinking that riches are only money. It can be that nice new car. It can be that house that has more rooms than we have people and stuff to put in it. Wealth can mean a lot of things. And a lot of times the problem is not the thing, it's our focus on it. So, what are the challenges with a lot of wealth and a lot of happiness? Thoughts?
Most of the time, you're only looking inward.
You're only looking inward. Well, and that becomes a progression. If we talk about things that are wrong, a lot of the times we're talking about a progression of things. We don't start out thinking, you know what, I'm going to grow up and I want to be a dirty, filthy liar. We start out thinking, well, if I say this little thing that's just not entirely truthful, I'll be okay. And then the next one gets bigger, and the next one gets bigger, and the next one gets bigger. So, I agree with what Bob said. I would argue that's a further state of being deceived by riches. Because, is there anything wrong with wanting a decent car? No. It gets us here. It gets us to work where we have a responsibility to be. We'll talk about work too. Know anybody that works all the time? Not because they have to, but because they have decided to? Okay, we'll get into that in a few minutes. There's nothing wrong with having a decent car. It's a matter of, do we start sacrificing what is right to get that car? Jay?
It becomes a distraction.
Excellent word. Excellent word. Riches very quickly become a distraction. Speaking of distractions, I'm going to take a little bit of a departure here. In the article that we have for this morning, it says, and I know this is from the King James, that the love of money is the root of all evil. I argue with that. In part because I use New King James. So I thought, okay, make sure that I understand what I'm saying before I say this. That's not what the original text, the majority of the original text, say. New King James says, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. So, to make sure that I'm right in what I'm about to say, I went to that literal translation where it says, for a root of all the evils is the love of money, which certain, longing for, did go astray from the faith, and themselves did pierce through with many sorrows. I say that to make a distinction. The love of money is horrible. The love of money will send a Christian to hell. But the love of money is not the only basis of evil in the world. It's important to understand that because we're going to progress this conversation about the love of money to the distraction point, to that inward looking. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your attention and look forward to the next few weeks. Thank you.